in our study of the book of Daniel. We are in chapter 6, which includes the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. The events recorded here seem to have occurred very early in the administration of Darius the Mede, the client king installed over the province of Babylon by Cyrus the Great. Darius seems to have just been getting his government organized and stabilized, with Daniel as one of the senior administrators. The system had been in operation long enough, though, for Daniel's sterling qualities to have come to the king's attention, with a promotion to an office along the lines of prime minister on the horizon. It would take at least a year for the political situation to develop to this point, suggesting a date for chapter 6 of not earlier than 538 BC. So let's begin our reading. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, so they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Daniel would have been well into his 80s by now, and perhaps it was his legendary reputation for wisdom, integrity, loyalty, and courage that motivated Darius to lure Daniel out of retirement and back into public service, only this time in the interest of Persia. However, the move generated a great deal of resentment against Daniel on several levels. In terms of pure professional jealousy, his co-administrators were certainly displeased to learn that Darius was planning to promote Daniel ahead of them. In terms of generational rivalry, the young Turks in the administration were probably anxious for this old geezer to get out of the way and make room for them at the top of the pyramid. In political terms, the fact that Daniel, who for 70 years had been a loyal official of the Babylonian Empire, should now be promoted to the highest echelons of the Persian government, rather than languishing in the deepest depths of a Persian dungeon, was probably galling to those who had served the new regime over the long haul. And in nationalistic terms, the fact that Daniel, a Jewish provincial, should be placed in a position of authority over native Medes and Persians must have been insulting and humiliating to his antagonists. So, once again, we find Daniel's peers plotting against him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: "King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Daniel's devotion to his God continued to be his most distinguishing characteristic. For his enemies, despairing of ever finding fault with his professional, moral, or ethical conduct, Daniel's religious convictions provided the only opportunity for discrediting him in the king's eyes. Their plan was to put Daniel's loyalty to his king and his loyalty to his God at cross purposes with one another and force him to choose between the two. And clearly, what his choice would be was never in doubt. A peculiar legal principle in the constitution, if you will, of the Medo-Persian Empire maintained that any edict or decree set down in writing and sealed with the king's signet seal could not be repealed, even by the king himself. Esther 8 and verse 8 refers to the same principle. With that in mind, the administrators and satraps went as a group to visit the king. Such a large and united group was probably intended to strongly influence or even intimidate the puppet king into granting whatever they asked. They proposed that Darius issue and seal a royal edict proscribing prayer to any god or man other than the king himself for a period of 30 days. And the king complied, apparently without so much as a question. The nature of this royal edict was similar to that of Nebuchadnezzar concerning the work of the golden image. The temporary nature of the mandate indicates that it was intended to be more of an exaggerated oath of loyalty to the king, rather than an actual attribution of divinity to him, especially considering the fact that Darius was only a provincial king under the authority of the Emperor Cyrus. In agreeing to and issuing this edict, Darius showed himself to not have been as strong a personality as Nebuchadnezzar. The idea of the edict did not originate in his own arrogant imagination, as Nebuchadnezzar's had. Rather, he acted upon the suggestion of his officials. And furthermore, he showed a tendency for being easily swayed by the glib and flattering tongues of his courtiers, while Nebuchadnezzar had always been large and in charge, never vulnerable to manipulation by sweet-talking opportunists. Well, we'll continue our reading at verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. The text states clearly that Daniel was fully aware of the royal edict when he returned to his home. And before an open window, he bowed towards Jerusalem in prayer to his God. This wasn't a reckless act of defiance, nor was Daniel possessed by a macabre death wish. Rather, it was the courageous continuation of a practice of more than 70 years' duration, a model of mature faith honed by long years of living in close relationship with God. It was the faith, courage, and loyalty that Daniel's enemies had been counting on to make their plan work. Well, when the satraps sprang their trap, the only one caught by surprise was Darius. And his reaction was not the fury of a bruised ego, as Nebuchadnezzar's would have been, but the anguish of a broken heart. He realized that he had been suckered into sentencing the most valuable advisor and counselor in his administration to a horrible death. He found himself handcuffed by his own foolish decree. He tried desperately to find a way to save Daniel, but the satraps would not let him off the hook. Finally, he gave in and issued the order, and Daniel was cast into a pit full of lions. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signets of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. As the stone was being placed over the mouth of the pit to prevent any possibility of escape, Darius's word to Daniel was probably more of an anxious expression of wishful thinking than a confession of a genuine faith. Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Won't he? But note the stark difference between Darius's attitude at the lion's den and that of Nebuchadnezzar when he threatened Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with the fiery furnace, when he had said, "What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Darius went the entire night without food or sleep. When daybreak came, the demands of the edict would be fulfilled, for better or worse. And at first light, without regard for royal dignity or deportment, Darius raced to the lion's den. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." As he draws near, hoping against hope, Darius cries out in a sobbing, anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And his distress was probably made even more conspicuous by the calm and the serenity in Daniel's voice when he answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." If Darius seemed weak and gullible before the incident of the lion's den, he acted with remarkable strength and resolve in the aftermath. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Darius was jubilant as he had Daniel raised from the pit of lions. When he stood before the king and before his accusers, there wasn't a scratch on him. It wasn't that the lions weren't hungry or aggressive. That would soon prove to be not the case, beyond any doubt. But it was because he had trusted in his God. This time, Daniel was not even given the opportunity to spare the lives of his accusers. Darius immediately sentenced them to the same fate that they had intended for Daniel, along with their wives and children. 120 satraps, 2 administrators, all their wives, and probably more than one apiece, and all their children would probably have totaled up to more than 1,000 people who were thrown to the lions. And it's highly unlikely that the lion's den, which was probably a dry, abandoned cistern, could hold that many people at once. So the executions may have continued for days. Now, whereas the lions had scarcely breathed on Daniel throughout an entire night, they literally tore his accusers to pieces before they even reached the floor of the den. And then Darius issued another edict, equally irrevocable and totally unprecedented. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar, following the fiery furnace event, had simply forbidden anyone in his realm to speak evil against the God of the Jews, Darius commanded that everyone under his dominion must actually fear and reverence, that is, worship, Daniel's God. Again, we must not read too much into this. We must not understand this to be a case of forced conversion of all the citizens of the province of Babylon. Like Darius's first edict and Nebuchadnezzar's command concerning the golden image, this was to be a one-time national expression of awe and respect for an extraordinarily powerful deity. Once fulfilled, the edict would make no further demands on the religious loyalties of the people. But again, it was an extraordinary expression of reverence for the God of Daniel. He is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. And here, the historical section of the book of Daniel ends, abruptly and ambiguously. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The statement itself is open-ended. We have no idea how long Daniel lived after his incident in the lion's den, nor how old he was when he died. It does seem, however, that this was Daniel's last serious test of faith. Thus far in our study, we have seen the rulers of the most powerful empires of their times being made to fall prostrate before Daniel's God. In the space of his own lifetime, Daniel had seen Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius, each in his own way, learn that they ruled only with God's permission and for God's purposes. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's confession, after recovering from his madness, best sums up the message of the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Our next lesson will take us into the second part of Daniel's book. In a series of heavenly visions, Daniel will be given a glimpse into the centuries beyond his own lifetime. Kings and kingdoms will rise and fall, and the fortunes of the Jewish people will be subject to the capricious whims of very powerful and very wicked people. But behind the calamity and chaos of a world that seems to have completely lost its way, God is still on his throne, working out a divine plan that will be brought to a successful and glorious conclusion for his faithful ones. This part of the book is written almost entirely in the apocalyptic genre. Its imagery and symbolism will sometimes be a challenge for us to understand, but it's an effort well worth the undertaking, and I hope you'll stay with me for the duration. You will bring forth